I hope that everyone is ready for the lesson today. I know it's been a long time coming, and I very much apologize. I very, very much apologize. I know it's been a lot. But we are here now, which means that we are ready to do some learning. We are here for advice lesson number 4, writing advice lesson number 4. And this time it's going to be on short stories. I actually did a lot of learning for this stream, and there's a lot of interesting information that I didn't know about short stories, so we're going to learn about it together. So, where do we begin with short stories? Well, personally, I think the place to start is with the whole idea of a short story. So, what is a short story? Let's go over a brief little overview. Let me also hide my head here. You're just gonna see the top of my head. I'm gonna point out the stuff with my little feather here. It's gonna be fine. It'll be fine. You know what I could do? I could do that whole does anyone know that VTuber trend that's happening on Twitter right now, where someone has their head portioned exactly like this, and then they like look forward and start going like and making slurping noises? I'm not gonna do that because I don't want any clips. I'm definitely not gonna be like, don't take that out of context. So what is a short story? A short story is a piece of prose fiction that can typically be read in a single setting and focuses on a self-contained incident or series of linked incidents with the intent of evoking a single effect or mood. Basically, it's not as complex as a novel. It doesn't have like multiple story arcs going on at the same time. The focus is usually a lot smaller, and it still tells a story, but not to the same length. As we can see, legends, myths, folk/fairy tales, and fables are considered the progenitors of the modern short story, which developed in the early 19th century. Now that is where things start getting really interesting. I didn't know that the modern short story, or what we view as a short story, I didn't realize that it started in the 19th century, in the 1800s. But we are going to learn a lot about it. Weirdly enough, it emerged around the same time in multiple places around the world. So we see short stories coming into light in Germany, from the oh my god, what is what is their first name? I completely blanked on their first name. In the United States, we get Washington Irving and Edgar Allan Poe as writers of the modern short story. And then in France, we have a person, I believe this is pronounced Maupassant, and Nerval. And also in Russia, from Gogol. So all these places and all these writers start to get the same like sense of writing a single moment down. And it wasn't necessarily called short stories at the time. I forget exactly what it was called. I think it was just called like incidents or something, especially in France. But basically what I'm trying to say is all these writers from all across the world, they start writing short stories at roughly the same time. And they all have their different little like quirks to it, as you can imagine. But weirdly enough, despite the fact that a lot of writers are focusing on like poetry and big novels and screenplays and stuff like that, the idea, the concept of short stories, it's actually well respected in the art community. Like, nobody turns their nose up into it and like, ugh, short stories. How dare you? Why not just write a full-length novel if you have an idea? But it's like, no, we can make this work. Yeah, let's do it. And they like bolster each other up. They're like very supportive of like, yeah, this short story's good. Yeah. They like review and critique each other's short stories. It's a very like cool thing to happen. It's like everyone's sprouting on this idea and they see the potential with it and they just run with it. So what happens next? Well, let's go into some of those critiques I had mentioned, these thoughts on short stories. As you can imagine, there were some that were like a little bit snooty about it. Some critics believed that short stories had to be quote unquote realistic in order to be considered a short story rather than a tale or a fable. Basically, it had to be something that focused on a human character in a real world setting. Otherwise, it would not count as a short story. It would be a fable, it would be a tall tale, it would be something like that. However, you get people like Edgar Allan Poe or Mark Twain's Animal Tales. You get people who are impressionist writers, which means that their stories focus more on the psyche of the narrator rather than the events that are transpiring. They're supposed to be about the person's mental state and how that adapts and changes. That's what Impressionism is. And we also have this nifty little quote by Edgar Allan Poe. If wise, he, being the writer, he has not fashioned his thoughts to accommodate his incidents, but having conceived with deliberate care a certain unique or single effect to be wrought out, like basically one idea that you want to express in the short story, he then invents such incidents. He then combines such events as may best aid him in establishing this preconceived effect. Basically, what he's trying to say here is you want to evoke a lot of events, as he says. You want these like little snippets that reiterate this feeling over and over, like really drive it home that yes, this person is going through a rough time, or this person is going crazy, or this person is like slowly descending into madness, things like that. I guess that's all pretty much the same thing, but if his very initial sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed in his first step. In the whole composition, there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not the one pre-established design. Basically, what Edgar Allan Poe is saying here is every word in a short story counts, and you need to make sure that all of it, is pointing toward the desired theme that you're going for. And I could sort of see that, because like I said before, short stories are all about length. And if you are working within the confines of a limited number of words, you want to make sure that those words carry a lot of weight. You want to make sure that even the first sentence brings out the emotion, brings out the theme that you're trying to go for. So I thought that was a very good piece of advice. I wanted to include it for anyone who wants to maybe think about what they want to do with their short stories. So, going off of that, what classifies as a short story? Well, typically, although definitions may vary based on publications, there's typically an agreed upon length. A lot of publications these days, they point towards length in order to discern whether or not something is a novel or a short story or even flash fiction. So a novel is usually 40,000 words or more. Apparently, the more modern day novels are closer to 80,000 words, which I think is a little bit ridiculous, personally, but who am I to judge? The novella is a lot shorter, 17,000 or 17.5K to 40,000 words. Then we got a novelette below that, which is 7,500 words to 17,500. Short stories are under 7,500 words, and flash fiction is under 1,000, typically. Like I said, ranges differ for some people or some publications, but that's typically what you have to go for. Some also based off of page length, I think, especially for flash fiction, but a majority of the times you're going to see them focus on word count. Next up, what do we want to write with our short stories? Well, we're also going to look at this quote by William Faulkner here to start. So William Faulkner, also a very prolific American writer, he says, I would say to get the character in your mind. Once he is in your mind and he is right and he is true, then he does the work himself. All you need to do then is to trot along behind him and put down what he does and what he says. What's being said there, and something that I actually have in mind as well when I do stuff, is you get an idea of the person, the like characters you want to write about, and you basically just like let them do their own thing in your head. And if you do it right, if you do it correctly, if you have a well-established character, I would say, the events that transpire, they kind of just bleed into themselves. Because like the character already has the motivation, the character is already doing all the legwork, all you need to do is get it down on paper. But I think it's also important to start from the beginning. You need to start with the theme, like Edgar Allan Poe was saying before. You need to start with an idea of what you're trying to write down. And then from there, you can look into what genre would best fit your theme. Like, what idea do you have, and like what ways do you think would best convey it? If you're trying to talk about isolation and loneliness, maybe you want to go for like a horror angle and then like also throw in some sci-fi in there. Or maybe you want to write about some like hilarious grand adventure, then you might look towards fantasy or something like that. Next, you go for the setting and the characters, and that's typically when you start to do a lot more of the writing instead of like the rough drafts and idea generations. Then you go to point of view, POV. Typically, I feel like when it comes to short stories, a lot of times the majority of them tend to be in third person limited specifically, but you also see some first person. Like, I would say it's like a 40-40 split between those, maybe even like 45-45. And then there's a very, very small percentage of short stories that go into second perspective. And for those of you who don't know what, or second person, I mean, for those of you who might not be familiar with second person, instead of saying I or he, she, they, stuff like that, it's you. Like, you do this, you go here. That's what second person is. It is very underused, and it's very hard to pull off, but there have been some writers to do a good job with it. Next thing that you want to focus on when it comes to your short stories is the length. Again, you want to make sure that all the words count, and you want to make sure that you get all your ideas across within the limited frame that you have. And then you want to look into what audience you're trying to reach. And finally, last but not least, any sort of prompts or challenges that you might want to add to like kind of spice things up to your writing. That's more of a personal effect rather than something that makes a good short story. But at the same time, it could be very good to generate some like artistry within your short stories. When it comes to challenges and things like that, let's say you're trying to write something, but you don't want to use the letter E. There's like a very famous book. I forget if it's a book or a short story, but I know there is a piece of writing out there, and it's very, very famous, where it does not use the letter E whatsoever. It's called Gadsby. It's a 50,000 word novel written in 1939 by American author Ernest Vincent Wright. So, it is a book that never uses the letter E. And for those of you who don't know, the letter E is the most common letter in the English alphabet. So the fact that there's a 50,000 word novel out there that does not use the letter E, like, that is very impressive. That is very, very impressive. And it's stuff like that. It kind of like challenges your brain to think of different ways, different perspectives to write these things out. Instead of being like limiting, debilitating, it sparks creativity. And that is the point of a good prompt or a good challenge. Prompts are especially helpful because they can kind of get the ball rolling as far as idea generation goes. But challenges, personal challenges that you want to add to your works, those I feel are where the creativity shines the most. There are like different resources you could probably use to find certain prompts or challenges online. You can also try to like think of some yourself for what you want to do, what sort of like interesting ideas, different notions you want to add to your writing. But it's just something to keep in mind. All right, next up. Where do you want to submit your writing? There are a lot of resources that you can use online, namely different websites that list literary journals and magazines and things like that. However, when it comes to sending in submissions to literary journals or magazines, you want to do your research. You want to look into what stuff they typically like to publish, like whether they focus on sci-fi stuff or whether they focus on realistic stuff with more of a dark undertone. Maybe they focus on mystery, short stories, things like that. You want to look into the different writers that they've published in the past. You want to read some of their stuff and just like make sure that you are also a good fit for what they're going for. Because otherwise, they're not going to take one look at what you're writing and they're not going to publish it. A website that I personally use called Submittable has a lot of places. Like, it basically compiles an entire database of places that have open submissions for not only short stories, but flash fiction and poetry as well. Some of the submissions do require an entry fee, typically when a form of payment is involved. Like if there's a contest going on of like, oh, hey, we want to get together like all the up and coming writers, and if you get published, we'll give you a cash prize or something like that. Like typically, if that's involved, there is going to be an entry fee, but it should be no more than $2 to $5. It's usually something small like that. And that's just to make sure that like you're serious about wanting to get published, and it's to make sure that they don't get swamped with a bunch of submissions. If they charge more, that is a little bit of a red flag. That could be a scam. That could be a scam. You just want to be very, very aware of that. I've actually, on a personal note, I was in a poetry scam. I was almost a victim of a poetry scam where they asked people to submit their poetry and get a response. So what ended up happening is I submitted some poems that I was really proud of, and I was like, okay, let's just see if I hear back from them. And I did. And they're like, hey, we really like your work. We'd like to get it published. And I was like, oh my God, that's so good. This was my first time getting published. This was right out of high school. So I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I would love to get published. Sure. And so I gave them my poems and stuff. And they said, okay, we've compiled you and a bunch of other up and coming writers into a book. Now, if you want to buy this book, you can do so for like $50 or something like that. And I was like, wait a minute. I don't think that's typically how poetry publications go. Typically, we're supposed to get like a free one ourselves if we get published in it, are we not? And so I looked into it, and yeah, it turns out that was a scam. They were trying to get people like basically in this sentimentality of, oh yay, I'm published now, and charge you a bunch of money for it. As we can also see, indie publications, websites, and blogs, those are also a place that you can submit your short stories. If you're finding it difficult to get your writing out there, you can just like make a blog of your own, or I guess an archive of your own, because that is another, that's more specifically like fan fiction, but fan fiction is also a very valid place to submit your writings and stuff. If you want to submit multiple times to different locations, like let's say you have a short story that you're really, really proud of, but you're not sure like where you want to submit it to. If you want to submit it to multiple places at the same time, that is perfectly acceptable. And it's actually encouraged. Like you should definitely spread your writing out and see who is like any takers. Essentially, you're basically saying, are there any takers for this short story or poem or something like that? And the more you get it out there, the more likely someone's going to want to pick it up, essentially. And if multiple people want to pick it up at the same time, like, cool, you basically get to take your pick. If you want to submit a piece that you had previously published, like let's say you had a piece that was published in like some small publishing agency, some literary magazine or something like that, and you want to republish it to a bigger magazine or a bigger journal or something like that, just make sure that you get the permissions to do so, because that could get a little iffy, but it still should be allowed. Like there are tons of short stories that get republished in different publications, like maybe a best of, or just anthologies especially. But yes, multiple submissions are okay. And not only just like multiple submissions, like submitting the same short story to multiple places, but also submitting multiple short stories to the same place. That's another route that you can go. Just make sure that you follow the guidelines of whatever place you want to submit to. Make sure that like if they say you can only submit like 2 short stories max, make sure you do that, or again, they might just skip over whatever you have submitted because you didn't follow the guidelines. Another thing that I like to do when it comes to submissions, like I especially like flash fiction as far as submissions go. And flash fiction is very interesting because as far as short stories go, flash fiction is even more recent. Like I want to say flash fiction started arriving kind of at the turn of the 20th century, maybe even sooner, like in the past 60 to 70 years. That's when we start seeing flash fiction. And it was kind of the same story as short stories, where people didn't turn their nose up to it. They were very supporting of what it was as an art piece. And flash fiction is also incredibly interesting because it basically takes the confines of a short story and makes it even narrower. Like, the words in a short story are supposed to lend weight to whatever theme you're going for. Flash fiction, that's even more important. Flash fiction word choice is so crucial. You want to make sure that you get the most amount of like evocative emotion or going towards the themes. You want to make sure that every word in the flash fiction is doing that to the best of their ability. So you want to make sure that you're using the right adjectives, the right verbs, the right everything. And again, that can sound very daunting and challenging, but that's also part of the fun of the creative experience. You get to like show off, you get to flex your creative muscles and show like, I was able to make this really cool piece about like trauma or something like that. And I did it in 5 words. What is the biggest lesson to learn here? When it comes to short stories, as you can imagine, they don't pay the big bucks. You are not going to get a lot of money when it comes to submitting short stories, but they are a great way to build your repertoire. They're a great way to get your name out there and show the world that, hey, you're serious about your writing and you want to share it with people. So you kind of start building up a name for yourself through short stories, and then maybe a publishing agent, a literary agent, maybe they pick up your work. Maybe they see it in an anthology somewhere and it's like, wow, this writer's really good. They would be a great fit for the angle we're sort of going for, you know? However, just because they are a stepping stone towards like maybe building up your career, that does not mean that you shouldn't treat it with the same care and quality that you would any other writing. Short stories are still like part of the creative process. Even if they're smaller than like a novel or a novelette, they still carry a lot of weight, and they're still, again, well respected within the creative community. So you want to make sure that you show off the best of your abilities as you would with a bigger project. And most importantly, do not get discouraged when it comes to getting rejection letters, because believe me, you are going to get a ton of rejection letters when it comes to submitting your short stories to places. It's not necessarily your fault. It's not supposed to be a reflection on your abilities as a writer. It's just the way things go. Maybe there's somebody else who had a really good piece that they wanted to add to their literary magazine or what have you, and yours just unfortunately didn't make the cut. But you're not supposed to take that as a way of saying like, oh, you're a bad writer and you should stop writing. No, keep writing. Because the only way that you're going to improve, the only way that you're going to get published is if you keep writing. Personally, I am right there with you, honestly. I've had so many instances of getting discouraged from rejection letters after rejection letters after rejection letters, especially coming right out of college. And it eventually got to the point where I was just burnt out. I felt like I couldn't make the achievements possible that I wanted to with my writing. But eventually I fell in love with VTubing, and I saw people like cheering people on with their creativity, their creative endeavors. Like, yeah, you could do it. Like, that's what VTubing has always been for me. VTubing has always been about self-improvement and like everyone kind of improving off of that, building off of that energy and improving themselves. So it's like the VTuber themselves, they improve, and then their fans also improve, and they help each other improve, just like in small ways, in helping their writing or their art, things like that. And it's really, really cool. So after I fell in love with VTubing, I decided I'd give writing another go, and bam, I got 2 short stories published. I got 2 short stories published in the same anthology, and I was the only person. I don't know if I was the only person to submit multiple entries or what, but I was the only person in that anthology to have 2 published works. So, it's just a little humble brag there. You also want to do a lot of like reading. That is another big thing. If you want to get published, a good way to know like what's hot and what's not is to do reading of modern day short stories, or just short stories that have withstood the test of time. See what ideas they have going for them and see why people like them so much and see why you like them so much as well. With that in mind, I have some recommendations for short stories here. So very first one, we have The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1843. Telltale Heart is just an absolute classic. You can definitely get a sense of what Edgar Allan Poe was talking about, where like he said the first sentence should clue you in right away of what the short story is going to be like. Because Telltale Heart starts out, this guy is telling the like listener basically, you think I'm mad, or you think me mad, things like that, because he's trying to tell this way that he like offed his master. He's trying to tell it in a way that doesn't make him sound crazy. There's also The Monkey's Paw. The Monkey's Paw is another like very classic, well-read short story about a magical monkey's paw that grants 3 wishes, but the wishes are cursed, as you might imagine. Like, they have very unintended and very heinous consequences. There's also The Lottery, a famous, especially in high school curriculums, a very famous short story about a small town that has a tradition that is maybe not the best for its people. There Will Come Soft Rains by Ray Bradbury. There Will Come Soft Rains is my favorite short story. I remember reading this in 1st grade, and it's weird because I fell in love with Ray Bradbury in high school. Like, Fahrenheit 451 was the book that made me decide, you know what? I want to be a writer. And I didn't realize that I had actually read some of his work before in elementary school. There was another one, I forget what it's called, but it's like this hotel, and the lady running it poisons the people with poisoned tea. It's got cyanide in it, and it tastes like bitter almonds. And that's how you clue in to where, like, if somebody ever mentions bitter almonds in a short story or a novel, it's cyanide. Like, little writer's tip right there. It's always cyanide. They're being poisoned. That's just how it go. But yes, There Will Come Soft Rains is a post-apocalyptic sci-fi about a smart house. And it is so, so good. It is so well done. I love it. 2 bits. Flowers for Algernon, another one I read in 1st grade, and another highly, highly recommended short story. I love this one so, so much. It is so heartbreaking, so like thought-provoking. It is very, very good. It's about a person who, they have a learning disability. They have a learning disability, and they undergo a surgery to like reverse it, essentially, and they become a super genius. And it's done in an epistolary style, which means it's done in like little notes, basically. This one is done in the form of a journal entry. Or I think epistolary might be specifically done in letters, but I mean journal, it's essentially the same thing. The Mustache. The Mustache is another one. I think I read that in 3rd grade, maybe? Or maybe I also read it in 1st grade, I can't remember. But it's about this kid who, he grows a mustache and he goes to visit his grandma in a retirement home. And she has this conversation with him that basically makes it seem like she's talking with her late husband and things like that, undergoing some sort of dementia or something like that. And I'll leave it there, but there's a reason why it's called The Mustache. I'll say that much. The Jaunt by Stephen King. For those of you who don't know The Jaunt, I actually read this a couple of years ago for the first time. So The Jaunt is a sci-fi horror about basically space travel, teleportation. Teleportation is a thing, and there's this dad who's explaining how it works to his kids, and basically talking about the history of how this came to be. But the thing about this teleportation, the teleportation only works if you have your eyes closed. If you don't have your eyes closed, some really, really bad things happen. And if you read the short story, you'll find out why. The Things They Carried. Now, The Things They Carried is the name of the short story, but it's also the name of the anthology that it comes from. The Things They Carried is about war. I had a high school teacher, a high school English teacher, who was like really, really big on O'Brien and the like lessons learned from his short stories. So kind of want to pass that on. We definitely read this in class, I remember, and it's good. It's good. Teach us some good morals. These are also some anthologies. A little bit of a cheat, I know, but at the same time, they're very good. So the first one is called In the Land of the Lawn Weenies. There's also a sequel called Invasion of the Road Weenies, I believe. It's a bunch of like silly, quirky little short stories and stuff written by this guy, but they can also take some dark and twisted turns. Like, it's definitely meant more so for kids, but at the same time, it's kind of like baby's first horror novel, essentially. If you want a little, I guess, sneak peek, a little glimpse into the childhood of Archie O'Keeliday, hummingbird VTuber extraordinaire, you can start with that. And then Vampires in the Lemon Grove. This one I read in college. This is by Karen Russell. Vampires in the Lemon Grove is also the name of a short story in the anthology, but there are a lot of good short stories inside the anthology. There's another one where like these ladies get turned into silkworms and have to like produce silk. I think it's called Silk for the Empire. Yeah, Silk for the Empire. Also very good, also very horror and weird, but yeah, definitely check these out. Definitely check all of these out. They are well worth your time. Especially if you want to get into what makes a good short story, essentially. Short stories, like, there are a lot of interesting things to learn about them, but I think a thing about it is, like, when it comes to teaching about writing, it's really difficult because, you know, you can't just tell somebody the techniques of how to write good, how to write well, because it's different for everyone. Everyone has their own style, their own voice that they have to foster and develop and grow into. So when it comes to that stuff, we can only teach the technical stuff. We can't teach you how to like build your voice in a very intuitive way, because it's different for everyone. Tell me how to write well. I can try.